So I'll kind of boil this one down, but the question was essentially, how do you shoot in low light and be able to process your image so that it's not too grainy?
The $1 million question.
Yeah, so this one's a little bit loaded because they're, and all of these kind of are, which I don't think is a bad thing, but so let's talk about low light shooting in general, right? Some of the reasons that you would want to do it are either because you want to shoot like, some stars or some light painting or a sunset, that sort of thing. You can run into some trouble there.
But also like at a wedding, you've got reception, you've got, end of the night dancing, the whole deal. It's usually just, kind of string lights, very low light scenario.
So I'll kind of divide it into two spectrums. So you have the spectrum of intentional low light shooting and unintentional.
Yeah.
For me, unintentional would be more in the wedding category or events, or you're at a spot and you don't have any other option but to shoot in low light.
Yeah.
And the other would be intentional. So intentional is a little bit easier. So we'll just kind of knock that out of the way, and Mike, feel free to add anything. But for me, if I'm in an intentional spot and I want to shoot an image clean, rule number one is a tripod if you have the option. Right. Let's go ahead and take stability out of it so we can eliminate all shake.
Yep.
And if you have one that can get low to the ground, awesome.
And what are your typical settings? Let's say you are handheld. Let's say you are handheld in a low light scenario. What are your typical settings on your camera?
Let's get to that on the forced side of things, because I think that'll be a little more relevant, because if you can control it and we take the shake out of the way, then from a setting standpoint, ideally treat it. I kind of treat it as if I'm shooting in the daytime. And what I mean by that is I'll go ahead and first I choose my ISO, which is just your light sensitivity, right? I go ahead and take it way down because all ISO is in some form or another directly tied to grain, right? That's also going to be relative to your camera, right? If you're on a GoPro, you might be able to get away with 400 and call it a day before it gets really noisy. Yeah. If you're on a higher end Sony, you can go to like ISO 1,000,000. I mean, those things are amazing. But that being said, I typically like to stay at 800 or less at nighttime. Then from there, I'm going to dial in my aperture to figure out how much of the frame I need in focus. And then the last thing is going to be the shutter speed. And all I'm trying to do most of the time is start with an even exposure, right? What I mean by that
right in the middle.
You look on the meter on your camera, go right in the middle and start from there. From there, I'm just rocking my shutter speed back and forth, right? I've got my grain eliminated with a very low ISO for whatever camera you're on. We've got the stability taken out of the way, and we've got the depth of field, so your f-stop handled just based on how deep you want something in focus. And from there, it's pretty easy. Now back to your point of what settings would you use if you can't control.
Because again, I feel like the majority of the time, at least for me, when I find myself shooting in low light, I do not have a tripod. It was not intentional, and you just got to make the best of it.
Right.
To circle back, like what are I know what my settings are. I want to hear what are if it's a wedding, it's the reception. We have some string lights up. There's not much going on. What are your go-to settings?
So do I have an on-camera flash or no?
For the first scenario, let's just say no on-camera flash.
Okay, if you don't have an on-camera flash, and I'm not talking about the built-in flash that pops up, I'm talking about a speed light, something that an external light flash that you put on the hot shoe, and you can control that, because that also will change things a bit. So let's say that all you've got is a body and a lens, and you got to get it done. So the thing that I always hold firm to is no slower than 1/100th of a shutter speed. Now, I break that rule often sometimes, but in an ideal world, 1/100th is almost guaranteed a clean shot. Now, the rule is double your focal length, right? So if I'm shooting on a 70 to 200 at 200, in theory, I should be at 1/400th. However, if your lens has image stabilization on it, just kind of remove that from the equation for now, because that can cheat things a little bit too. But let's say a basic lens and body, 1/100th is a great shutter speed to start on. And then from there, you're going to kind of want to open your lens up as high as it can go. And again, take that with a grain of salt, right? If you're shooting something far away, you got a lot more liberty to open it up than something up close. It just you know the deal. It depends on what you need in focus. But ideally, let's say that we have a really common lens. We'll say a 24-70,
2.8,
2.8 throughout. That's also a big deal if it's a constant aperture or variable. But let's say that it's a 2.8 throughout. I'm going to go 1/100th, 2.8, and then I'm going to start rocking that ISO up until I get the image that I want.
Sure.
Now that said, you've got grain, right? There's no way around it.
Yeah.
And I would encourage people that grain is not a bad thing. Not always, right?
Yeah.
To a point. Here on the Good Grain podcast, we love grain, right? We named the show after that, and there's something about having a texture to your image that
it gives it another layer,
right?
Yeah,
it's a texture. It's something. It's something tactile to the image that you don't get otherwise. That said,
yes,
it can ruin an image for sure.
About to say, that being said, it's a double-edged sword. Like the grain can be good,
It can be,
but can very easily get out of hand and make your image just, unusable.
Right. So now if we do have an on-camera flash, at that point, I'm going to try to stop my ISO on something I know for my camera. And I would say you're just going to have to do some testing. Go outside, shoot at every 100 increment, 1, 2, 400, and go from there, and then look at it on camera and then say, okay, this is acceptable, and then introduce the on-camera flash and say, okay, how much output do I need to to bring into my scene to keep my shutter at 1/100th, to keep my ISO at wherever I want it to be, and my aperture there. Then you're just bringing in extra light. So that still counts as low light, but we're introducing a light source.
Yeah, and I would say, your lens plays a pretty big factor. And low light, like even 2.8 is great, but I'd say even in that scenario, and in the later evening of the wedding when we're shooting a reception or something like that, I'm probably going to be on a prime that's going to 1.4, 1.8, somewhere in there, and just doing what I can.
And you figure out your style. I mean, if I've got a 1.4, ideally I'm going to actually want to stop it down as far as I can. To get a little bit more, but that may even be like 1.8 or f2. That's really just to mitigate some errors that every lens kind of brings to the table. But that aside, you're right.
Yeah, and I would say, whenever we go camping and it's blue hour, it's starting to get into the completely just pitch black. Headlamps are on.
Right.
When I'm shooting that kind of scenario, my settings are probably 1/100th or 1/60, probably 1.4, and about 1600 ISO.
And that's really safe.
And I'm doing that in camera, and then when I get into post, I may be bringing it up a quarter of a stop or more. But in camera, I'm staying close to those settings because I know for what I shoot with 1DX2 or EOS R, that's going to deliver usually a pretty clean image. But again, it's blue hour, it's nighttime. You're not trying to make the whole scene illuminated. I feel like that's a big part of it when you're shooting low light. You obviously, when you're shooting low light, you most of the time you're wanting that low light look. You're not trying to make it look like daytime. It's low light. Like, if we're shooting at blue hour while we're camping and there's headlamps on, like I want to capture that really cool, dusky, very, sundown look. And so again, I don't want it to look bright and airy. I want it to look darker and, just a little more heavy with just that headlamp guiding the whole image.
And I think that's a great point of taking in the final result into the in-camera portion of things. And I will say that, I'm a personal believer of your gear doesn't necessarily matter, but this is one area where better gear really does make a difference. Like in my mind, if you're shooting in daylight, you can get by with a lot and make a fantastic image.
You can go to Target right now.
Right, that is almost indiscernible from others depending on what it is. But in low light, this is where you earn that money back.
Yep.
And obviously it depends on the situation.
Yeah,
but this is one area.
But still, your knowledge goes a long way. Like you can have the fastest glass in the world and the best low light camera out there, and you can still have a terrible image.
So let's go back to your point of when you're shooting camping and obviously you don't want to bring a ton, so you're kind of just going a body and lens and calling it a day. When you bring it back into post, what's kind of your workflow for the second part of the question, which was was how do we process it to make it clean. Now, and I'm going to do the caveat of we are specifically talking about using Adobe Lightroom.
Yep.
If you have another similar software, most of the same rules will apply. But if we reference something specific, we're really talking in that software. And I would encourage anybody to spend the $10 a month and get the the Lightroom Photoshop bundle. It's very well worth it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, before we even dive into the processing, and what you said earlier is a big point, is of knowing what you're going to do with it while you're shooting it. You know, and for most of the time, all my images are going to social media, right?
Right.
So you can get away with a lot. But when I'm shooting a scenario like that where camping, it's low light, really what I'm shooting for, kind of what we talked about, is a middle of the road as I can get. So I want to try to make sure my shadows aren't crushed. I haven't lost all the information, but I don't want I shot an image. It's one of my favorites ever. The moon is out, so like a very bright, ball in the sky.
Right.
And there's two people with headlamps on, and it's blue. It's past blue hour. Like the sun it's almost pitch black. Right. So all you can really see are the headlamps, the outlines of the people, and the moon, it's obviously a tricky scenario because the moon was very bright, the headlamps were very bright, and people were very dark. So what I was trying to do was make sure as best as I could in camera that I wasn't losing all the information on the people. Because in my mind, in post, I can bring up those shadows a little bit.
Right.
While as long as I still have my highlights, I can pull those back down so it's not just a blown out circle in the sky. So while I was shooting it, I was aware that in post, I'm making sure while I'm shooting, I know I can lift later.
Right.
And once I got that into that image, so again, we're shooting at dusk, blue hour, whatever you want to call it, camping. When I got into post, the first thing I did was I lifted the exposure a little bit. Lifted the shadows a little bit to where I got a little bit of detail. There was noise on the people.
And you do really want to reference your histogram whenever you're doing this.
Yes.
That can be a separate conversation. But
100%. Lifted my exposure a little bit, lifted my shadows, and then pulled back my highlights down to keep everything down. But for the most part, I mean, that was the first thing I looked at was, can I lift these shadows at all? And I shot it. I think I remember the settings. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was like 1/60th or 1/50th of a second, around 1600 ISO at 1.4.
Right.
And I mean, they turned out good. Again, it's not a completely even exposure, but that's not what I was going for. Like I wanted a silhouette look. I wanted the focus to be the people with the headlamps looking up at the moon. So I wanted the moon to be, not be blown out. I wanted the headlamps not to be blown out, and the shadows on the people were crushed a little bit. So you did lose that information. So this is what you're going for. Again, it's the processing is all about what your end result is and what you're going for.
And I'll say for the folks who care about the little bit more of the technical side of how to process noise out. So you basically have two channels that your noise lives in. And if you don't like the science behind digital stuff, forgive me now, you can fast forward a hair. But you basically have, we'll call it color and light noise, right? So you have your luminance and your chroma noise. So essentially, when you're in noise reduction, you can't just pull down the luminance noise and expect for everything to go away. It's widely regarded that if you split your image into the three main curves, the RGB, right, the red, green, and blue values, most of your noise is going to live in those blues. Right. So one really simple thing you can do is just desaturate the blues. Right. That's going to pull a lot of the noise out. Obviously, be wary of your image. If you're shooting at blue hour and you're desaturating blues,
you're going to lose a lot of info.
It's going to kind of kill a lot of the vibe.
Sure.
That said, there's some other things you can do to recover, but that is one option, is just to pull some of the saturation out. It doesn't necessarily remove the grain, but it removes the color out of that grain. It removes some of that chroma, those chroma values. In Lightroom, I think it's just referred to as color noise, but it's a dance between your luminance and your color and those two sliders. That said, all noise reduction does soften your image a little bit, which is a big reason why we really want to shoot at a faster shutter speed when possible, so that when you soften, you're not going off the deep end there.
And I will say, for the most part, and I'll let you get right back to it, I try to not use any kind of noise reduction as much as I can, because it softens so much. And I would say 90% of the low light images I shoot, if I have to add too much noise reduction to it, I just don't even use it, because in my mind it's not a usable image. Like that's just as a personal thing. I just don't like it. It's just not something I try. I just try to avoid it. The other thing I do on pretty much every single image, but especially low light images, is go into the sharpness panel. Again, we're talking about Lightroom.
Right.
You can hold on a Mac, you hold the Option key and you click masking, and you can actually select which parts of the images your sharpness is being applied to. And so you can, make it not apply to the grain. Very small, subtle thing, but it does help.
Right. So it obviously doesn't remove the grain itself, but again, we're trying to take your eye off of the grain and have it focus somewhere else. So one thing that you can do very easily is you can burn those shadows. So the concept of dodging and burning is just lightening is dodging, burning is darkening. You can do that with a selective brush, a mask. You take your image into consideration. But you can totally just make some areas a little bit darker. Obviously, that's going to remove some and it's some attention to the noise. It's going to take your eye where you want it to go.
It's all the subtle changes you make that help the image be great. There's not one trick in the bag that's going to just make the image fantastic. So it's all the little things that you can do to help your image along. And again, like James said a second ago, it really is not. It's not about removing all the grain. It's where people's attention is going. It's just kind of like, sleight of hand. Like you're making people watch one thing while you're doing something else. It's not about removing it. It's about drawing attention.
Right. So that's a really great question. I hope we answered that. If there's still some things that you want to discuss, hit us up on our Instagram. Send us another message or shout another question out. We'd love to talk about this further. So great question.